I'm going to be talking about harmony in API design. Just a quick intro. I founded a company called Apiary. I'm not a designer, disclaimer. How many of you guys in the audience are designers? Just like, show of hands. Developers? Anybody here a developer? It's about half and half. Okay, good. So I'm a developer, but I have a passion for design, and I co-founded my company with a designer. And we really kind of thought a lot about what design means for APIs and what design means for developers. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but before I get started, I'll just give you like 5 very quick, simple rules on your API to make sure that it's awesome and great, except I won't, because there is no such thing as 5 good rules for designing an API. I'm sorry to break it to you. So instead of that, I want to take that opportunity to think a little bit, to like change your thinking about APIs. I feel that still these days, sometimes API is like one of those things where, you have some data and you like, boom, you slap an API on top of it and it's done. It's like sorted, right? And it turns out that doesn't work well that way. And so I'll be talking a little bit about the beginnings and the foundations about what actually is an API and how it's relevant to like user-centered design and stuff that you've been hearing from Sean as well. So what is an API? At the core of it, the important part is the interface. I actually looked up the dictionary definition, and I liked it so much I put it up here on the slide. The second, the one that's highlighted as computing definition, is device or program enabling a user to communicate with a computer. It's a device that enables a user to communicate with a computer. That is exactly what an API is, right? So think about it a little bit. What else is a device that enables a user to communicate with a computer? Well, it's a user interface, right? So like, first way that you can think about an API is that it is a user interface. It's just a user interface for a very particular kind of user that happens to be a developer, but it is still a user interface. And basically all of the principles that you might have heard about in user interface design still apply in API design. So let's dissect it a little bit, what I mean by that. So, when we're thinking about user interface, one of the first things that comes to mind is user experience. You might be thinking, well, how the hell is user experience relevant to an API? But it very much is. You do have an experience when you're using an API. And I think Sean, for example, mentioned like how easy it was to get started with the Stripe API. You might be thinking about design itself, whether that means aesthetics or whether that means like usability. Both of those things are very much relevant in an API, and I'll show you examples after that in a second. You should totally be thinking about emotions that like your user interface evokes in your users when they're using it. Are they frustrated? Are they happy? Are they trusting? Are they suspicious? All of those things are totally relevant in an API. You can be, actually this is an important one. Every user interface is by definition subjective. You're never going to find one size that fits all. And it's subjective not just by you asking your colleague, like all designers probably in the audience know that everybody's a critic when it comes to design. So that's one way to think about subjective. But it's also, for example, very culturally dependent, right? And that doesn't just mean that you're going to do a different API for your Asia and Pacific market. It also means in the context of an API that you're going to do a different API for your Python community than for your Java community, for example. Because those are totally like cultural islands, that are defined around them and around the frameworks that are around the languages. And there are different things that are typical or different things that are intuitive and commonplace. There's different things in the Ruby community and different things in Erlang community, for example, that are expectable. So you totally have the problem of thinking about what is intuitive for your users and how it is dependent on the context where they're coming from. But overall, like if you want to sum up the thinking about user interface, I think like the one thing that everybody's striving for is just simplicity. And simplicity is really hard. It means thinking about things until your head hurts and then thinking some more and like trying to cut away features, cut away decisions, cut away questions until you just really arrive at something that is just so simple you can't take away anything anymore, right? And that that totally applies to an API. Like if you think about an API as something where you expose all the myriad of options that you can do in like the first API call, then I guarantee you everybody's going to be very unhappy. But if you start thinking about how can I ask the user the least and assume the most, and then maybe later let them override, then you're really getting into a mode where you're thinking about simplicity. So when we're thinking about user interface, there's also things, how do you measure user interface, and how do you apply that measurement from a user interface to an API, to a programming interface? So one thing that you often try to measure is productivity, right? If I have that specific UI or API, how quickly can I get something down? How productive am I doing that? You can totally try to measure that. You can measure conversion rates. If you have a certain design, a certain layout, a certain onboarding process, how many people actually bother versus if you simplify it. And you can totally do the same thing with an API. And I think one thing that really evolved in the user interface design community is kind of usability studies, really trying to get into the mind of your consumer by seeing them, observing them in real life, trying to use your product. And that in the context of an API is often replaced by hackathons, but it's still the same thing. It's still going out there, looking at people using your API, trying to understand what they're going through. So that's API as a UI to data or UI to a computer for developers. And that's all great, but even if you think about all of these things, even if you try to do your absolute damn best so that you feel the API is simple, you feel the API is productive, you feel the API is pleasing, you can still fail. And when we think about why, and it happens very frequently, then let's go back to that definition that we looked at before, and let's go to the non-computing definition. Let's go to the human definition of what an interface is. It's a point where two systems, or subjects, or organizations meet and interact. It couldn't be more true for an API. That is totally where two organizations meet and interact. On one side, you have the provider. On the other hand side, you have the consumer. Sometimes you call them the back-end team and the front-end team. I kind of don't like that because that assumes that API is only used by front-end people. That's totally not true anymore these days. But one of them is exposing some functionality and the other one's trying to use it. So let's think about those two groups. Let's think what goes through their head as they're working. When you go to the provider side, they might be working in one of the backend languages. They're maybe building a Rails app or Node.js app, or maybe they're running it in Go. And that defines a lot of what is intuitive for them, and that defines a lot of what they consider simple. But when you go to the consumer side, they might be using Objective-C if they're running an iOS app, or maybe Swift. They might be using Angular. They might be using Polymer, whatever is the latest and greatest in frameworks. But that is a very different background that they're coming from, right? That is a very different kind of set of expectations that they have, very different set of what they consider intuitive. Now, additionally, on top of that, not only are they using different languages and thinking in different terms, but they also have different priorities, right? When you think about the provider, they're thinking, they're thinking about stuff like, how do I make sure that the API stays up and I don't have to be woken up in the middle of the night? Or is this going to be fast enough? I mean, how can I cache this stuff? Is it secure? Am I going to get fired? Versioning, what's going to happen with that? That's the stuff that's their consideration as the priorities of what is a successful API. But when you look at the people that are going to use your API, they're thinking in completely different terms, right? They're thinking stuff like, the TTFHW, that's the horrible shortcut for time to first hello world. How quickly can I get this started? That's the onboarding that we just talked about. Or they're thinking about, can it be done at all? I don't even care how long it takes, but can I do it at all? I've got a use case. I'm going out to the Twitter API. Can I get this done? Is it available? That's an important thing that I want to get answered. Or maybe they're thinking about latency. How long are you going to take before you can answer something? They're thinking about debugging. It's not working. What do I do? How do I debug this stuff? Are there some examples I can use? If not, where's customer support? How can I contact somebody who's not going to try to sell me shit, but they're actually understand what I'm talking about? I actually once went through customer support for an API, I think for Zappos, and they were like asking for a shoe size. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I am having a problem with this API call. And I was like, what's your shoe size? And I was like, no, can you, somebody that, like knows what I'm talking about. It's different swim lane, please. So there's totally different like kind of knowledge clouds or like idea clouds that these two groups have. And it's really damn hard to be empathizing with the other group, especially for developers, right? Like that's not easy stuff. So I'll give you a couple examples, and then we kind of can fast track into what to do about it and kind of how to set up a process that can drive you towards trying to emphasize what your users are doing and trying to figure out how to build an API that works for them. And by the way, before I hear this totally applies for APIs that are internal within your company between two different engineering teams, just as much as for a Twitter API that's used by 1 million people all around the world. Because you always have a consumer, even if that consumer is on another team in your building. In fact, like that's actually why I started Apiary back then, is that we had two engineering teams within my company that were so much fighting. We literally lost years of development work because they were just fighting over an API surface. So, examples. So, I'll give you first a very well-known example that almost everybody knows, the Stripe API, that already Sean talked about. And I'll just kind of point out a couple things. You might not be able to read like the fine print, the actual code. But first of all, even when you look at it like from distance, you kind of recognize this 3-column layout. The right-hand side is black, the middle is white. I mean, by now, everybody's doing this stuff. But what you might not know is that Stripe actually pioneered this. I'm not aware of anybody else that's been rendering API documentation in this way before Stripe. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 companies, but they definitely like brought it mainstream. We at Apiary very shamelessly admit that we've kind of copied the design, as did many other companies around the world. But it has a lot of sense when you think about it. They have a column that's your navigation, that's your kind of left-hand column. They have the middle column that really focuses on talking to you. It focuses on describing the problem. It focuses on telling you how stuff works. It focuses on answering your question. And then they have like the right-hand column, which is like the messy, nitty-gritty details that you don't really want to be bothered when you're thinking. But then when you want to dive into detail, that's what you're really looking at, right? And by the way, that right-hand column, for example, happens to be on black background because that's what most developers use as terminal, and so they're used to syntax highlighting on black background. I mean, all of this stuff, all of this thinking went into that when they started with it. By now, it looks obvious, but back then, it was quite a revelation. Back then, API documentations did not look like this. And you might be thinking, how does the visuals of a documentation relate to actually like the JSON that I'm sending over the wire? And it turns out it actually relates a lot, right? Because one of the things we found out, for example, is that when we copied this design and we started giving it to our customers, and over comes a bank with like API requests that are 4 pages long, that design doesn't work anymore. Stripe can only afford this because they had an API so simple with payloads that are so small that they can render it in this way. And if you're in a different context, if you're in a different environment, if you're in a situation where you're catering to a different set of users than Stripe is, then you have to design your API surface, your data surface, and even your API documentation at the end very differently. The other thing I'll point out is that they, again, I think pioneered very successfully this very nice kind of like snippet of code, like it's this onboarding feature. It's like, it's just so simple, just copy paste these 3 lines of code and you're done. It's so tantalizing. It's like, I need payments and here's my code sample and boom, and I'm done. It's just the experience that people like have with this is totally emotional and totally kind of like UI driven, right? And you can even see that the surrounding, I on purpose put the whole page here, not just the code sample. You can see that the surrounding is very pleasing. It's all very calm. It makes it sound like it's all so simple. And that all emanates out of the culture and the identity of the company and what they're trying to represent. What Stripe came with was, we're going to disrupt a market that is arcane and complicated by making it super simple. But don't get me wrong, like I think we, developers, designers, we can get all like really stuck up with like stuff has to be beautiful, and if it's beautiful, it's right. But that's not necessarily the case. It's just right for Stripe because that's what they're trying to do in the market. That's their mission, is to simplify stuff. But then you have another example, which you also know, which is the Amazon Web Services, which nobody loves. I mean, who here loves the Amazon API? or the design. Like this just looks like some like Java class diagram kind of bullshit that just got generated somewhere. It's just like, ugh, right? I mean, why do this to you? But that's okay, because that's not who Amazon is. Like when you think about what Amazon represents from a culture or identity kind of point of view, they're kind of like Craigslist, right? Like nobody loves Craigslist, this is yucky. But it gets the job done, and it's very utilitarian, and it's very simple, and it kind of like broadcasts cheap, but that's what they want to do. They want to broadcast cheap, and Amazon wants to broadcast cheap. They're cheap, like that's what they're competing on. They're cheaper than anybody else. Their infrastructure, it's hardware, it's just like raw, brutal hardware, like why put bells and whistles on it? And it translates all the way down to how they render the documentation, and it even translates to the documentation itself. Like it's just XML in there and some yucky, multi-line IDs. Like, ugh, who wants to like copy that stuff? It's just like, it's really yucky to look at, but that's okay. Like it doesn't matter. What the Amazon API needs to do is it's going to be rock solid and scalable and usable in absolutely any language around the world. Not simple and beautiful and get started in 5 minutes, because you get started with AWS in 5 minutes and then you get stuck for the next 5 years. So maybe it doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes or 5 hours. So that's a kind of extreme example of how you have two very different APIs that are differently designed on the data level, differently designed on the API call level, and then it all the way kind of bubbles up to the API documentation and how that integrates with the culture of the company. And it's not just that it somehow is well aligned with the company identity, it's because they're thinking about who their target audience is and who their customer is, and then make decisions based on that. So how do we do that with our own API, and how can you guys do that with your own APIs to get to the practical part? So first of all, really start with a wireframe. Don't just start by sitting down and coding stuff and then shipping it. Try to think a little bit about what you're going to do and try to describe that stuff, right? And there's multiple different description languages that you can use for API. Swagger is very popular. API Blueprint is another one that we support at API. We support both of them. Or you can just write it in Notepad, but describe what you want to do. That's really important, because the next thing you can do is, once you do that, you can involve your customer. You can involve the people that are going to use this stuff, and you can ship it to them before you write a single line of code. And you're like, does this work for you guys? What do you think? And frankly, even when you look at it, it's kind of hard to intuit that this is going to work. So actually ask them to write some code against it. Ask them to try to write a little app, which means that you probably need to have something like a mock server stood up out of the API description. And there's tons of tooling on that as well, including Apiary, which is why we did it. So that you can kind of show an API to your customer before you're writing code and tell them, tell me what you think. Try to write an app. Give me feedback. Because no API is going to survive the contact with real-world scenarios when people are actually writing code and trying to parse your stuff and figuring out how it works or doesn't work for them. And then just do what developers do. Fork and pull request. Iterate. You guys are good at this stuff. So same applies to an API. Same applies to the design. Iterate around it, but involve the customer at the very earliest opportunity. Sometimes people get really stuck up with this whole if I show somebody my API before it's this perfect jewel, I'm going to be stuck with supporting it for the next 5 years, and it's going to be awful. I'm rather going to not tell anybody and just do this stuff. Well, you're going to release an API that's not working and stuck with supporting it for the next 5 years, and then you're going to have to ship a version 2 anyway. So you might as well kind of avoid that. Find a couple early adopters, find a couple friends, find a couple people that are willing to work with you. Even if you tell them this stuff is going to change in 6 months, you're probably going to have to throw away your code, but help me out and try this stuff and tell me what you think. And try it by writing code and using the API. Third, obviously, have a great documentation. Right? And that doesn't have to mean that has to be pretty and 3-column and black background like Stripe, but it probably means that it has to be exhaustive and accurate. Because if it's not accurate, then that is just super turn off. It's just you read something, you try it, it's not working, that is unexcusable. That is awful, 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 awful. And having a documentation that is super accurate and absolutely exhaustive really probably means that it has to be generated automatically. I'm sorry, but you can't write this in your hand and keep changing it all the time as you're making changes to your API. And thirdly, in order to be super accurate, we all know that in order for our code to work, it has to have like code coverage, test coverage for the code, and you should probably try to do the same for your API documentation. So specifically what that means is you have a description document that's like your API interface description, blueprint, Swagger, RAML, whatever, and then make it part of your continuous integration process so that every time you make a change to your API, every time you write a line of code, all your documentation gets run as a set of tests so that you can check that your documentation is accurate. And thirdly, fourthly, the most important thing, think about your API as a product. Right? It's not just this one thing where it's another way how to like make your program run is somebody making an API call. It is actually a process where you think about who your customer is, ask them for opinion, collect their feedback, like preferably before you start writing code, and then iterate on their feedback later as you go through the process. So that's it. A quick summary. Think about API as a UI. Ask your local designer what to do. They know best. They have this whole user-centered design thing, how to think about their users. Great stuff. Totally applies for an API. Try to involve your users early, because they're going to tell you what they find intuitive, not you. You don't know. You get stuck up in this whole idea that you're building something from developers to developers, so you know best what you're going to do for them, right? Not true. They're different developers than you are. Ask them. And then thirdly, automate, because otherwise you're never going to be accurate and exhaustive. Thank you.